Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with a concept that feels completely counterintuitive, especially if you're someone who likes to, take charge and get things done.
Right.
It's this idea that the only way to actually win a war is to surrender.
Completely. And we're not talking about military strategy here.
No, we are looking at the internal architecture of addiction recovery. Specifically, the famous 12 steps. Surrender to win. It's the phrase that has launched, I think, 1,000 confused looks in church basements.
It sounds like a paradox because it is one.
Mhm.
And to unpack this, we have a massive stack of sources today. We're looking at historical diaries from the 1930s. We've got some really sharp modern feminist critiques, some strictly biblical analyses, and then the latest secular scientific reviews.
You're all mixed.
And our mission is, well, it's pretty simple.
Yeah.
We want to find out where these steps actually came from. Because I think most people assume they just appeared one day, fully formed. That is the most common myth. People think Bill Wilson walked down a mountain with stone tablets or something. But the reality is that the 12 steps were a messy, argumentative, and very human evolution. They were born out of conflict.
And we also need to answer the big question that keeps coming up in the literature. Why is surrender to a higher power the core mechanism? Why isn't it try harder or learn more?
That is the most debated part of the entire system. But before we even get to the controversy, I think we have to clear up a historical identity crisis I see in the notes. We had a request to look at the connection between the 12 steps and the book of James.
Right. If you know the Bible, the book of James is all about faith without works is dead. It feels like it fits the AA vibe perfectly.
It does, and they definitely read the Bible, the Sermon on the Mount, Corinthians. But the James who really engineered the psychology of the steps, the guy who provided the intellectual blueprint, wasn't St. James.
It was William James.
William James, the Harvard psychologist and philosopher who wrote The Varieties of Religious Experience.
And that's a huge distinction.
It matters. William James, writing in the early 1900s, had this theory that to beat a life-threatening obsession like alcoholism, you needed what he called a psychic change. You needed to deflate the ego, catastrophically.
Wow.
So while the Bible provided some of the language, William James really provided the psychological map. He's the one who suggested that the self was the actual problem.
That shifts this from a purely religious conversation to a psychological one right out of the gate. So let's go back. It's the 1930s. The 12 steps don't exist yet. But there's this group called the Oxford Group. And reading these descriptions, they sound intense.
Intense is putting it mildly. The Oxford Group was a Christian fellowship led by Frank Bookman. They were massive in the 20s and 30s. And their slogan wasn't about sobriety. It was world-changing through life-changing.
So they were a revival movement.
Exactly. And they didn't have steps. They had what they called the 4 absolutes. These were the yardsticks you had to measure your life against every single day.
I have the list here. Absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love.
No pressure, right?
Right. That sounds like a tall order for a saint, let alone a guy shaking from withdrawal who just, ruined his family's finances.
And that was the problem. The Oxford Group was very much about moral perfectionism. They combined these absolutes with a process they called the 5 C's. You can see the structure of AA starting to form, but it's rigid.
Okay, let's run through those. Confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance.
A classic revivalist formula. And confession was the sticking point. They believed in sharing for witness. You didn't just confess in a dark booth. You confessed your sins publicly.
Which is terrifying.
Terrifying,
Right.
but effective for breaking isolation. Now, the early AA pioneers, guys like Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, they started out in these Oxford Group meetings. Before there was a big book, they were just doing a modified version of this. The sources say early AA really only had 6 informal steps.
The word of mouth steps.
Right. Not written down, just passed from one guy to the next.
Mhm.
It went something like this. 1, admitted we were licked. 2, got honest with ourselves. 3, got honest with another person. 4, made amends. 5, helped others without reward. And 6, prayed to God.
That's remarkably concise. It covers most of the bases of the modern 12 steps, just with less nuance. So why change it? Why not just stay part of the Oxford Group?
Culture clash. And this part of the history is fascinating. The Oxford Group was often associated with the wealthy, the influential, the polite. They were pious, respectable.
And the alcoholics Bill Wilson was dragging in off the street were not that.
Definitely not. These were people who had lost everything. The New York group found the absolutes suffocating. The sources quote them saying they were too rich for their blood.
They needed a triage unit, not a cathedral.
Exactly. They found the Oxford group too authoritarian, too aggressive. That friction is what forced Bill Wilson to break away and write a program specifically for people who failed at being pious.
Which brings us to 1938. This is the moment. The sources paint this vivid picture. Bill Wilson is at 182 Clinton Street. He's a few years sober, tired, cranky, and he's worried.
He's worried because the movement's growing, but it's messy. People are misinterpreting the word-of-mouth steps. It's like a game of telephone. He realizes if he doesn't write this down, people will wiggle out of it.
So he lies in bed with a yellow legal pad, asks for guidance, and in about 30 minutes, he takes those 6 loose ideas and splits them into 12 distinct steps.
He basically unpacked them. He looked at the 6 steps and said, "This is too vague. I need to close the escape hatches." He numbered them, and he later said he stopped at 12 because of the 12 apostles. He thought it had a nice ring to it.
But the draft on that legal pad isn't what we see today. And this is where the story takes a huge turn. The draft was super religious.
Incredibly so. It used the word God constantly. It had instructions about getting down on your knees, very churchy. And when he brought this draft to the group, the room exploded.
Enter the agnostic contingent.
Led by 2 guys, Hank P. and Jim B. They're the unsung heroes of this whole thing, if you ask me. Hank was a businessman, a skeptic, and he pushed back hard. He told Bill, "You are going to kill this thing before it starts."
Wow.
He said there are too many people burned by religion. If you shove God down their throats in step 2, they'll walk out and die.
That's a heavy argument. It wasn't just a theological debate. It was a life or death marketing decision.
It really was. The debate dragged on, and eventually they reached what the sources call the 10 strike, the compromise that saved the whole movement.
They added 4 words, God as we understood him.
It seems so small, but it changed the entire architecture. It shifted AA from being a religious organization to a spiritual fellowship.
Because suddenly the higher power didn't have to be the Christian God.
Right. It could be anything. It could be the laws of nature. It could be the group itself. Some people use the acronym GOD for group of drunks. It could be a doorknob, honestly. It opened the door for anyone willing to admit they weren't the center of the universe.
So let's dig into that mechanism. Step 1 is admitting you're powerless. Step 3 is turning your will over. I mean, in our modern context, telling someone you are powerless is usually an insult.
It is. And this is where people get hung up. But we have to look at the paradox of surrender. For an addict, they have already lost control. They're fighting a war against a chemical that they lose every single day.
So they're fighting, but they're not winning.
Exactly. They are under the illusion of control. I can handle it this time. By surrendering, they aren't becoming weak. They are finally admitting the reality of the situation. It's a strategic maneuver.
The sources mention a specific story here that links back to Carl Jung, the famous psychiatrist. This is the story of Roland Hazard.
This is the patient zero moment for AA. Roland was a wealthy American, a hopeless alcoholic. He travels to Zurich to be treated by Jung, the best mind in the world. Jung treats him, he goes home, and gets drunk immediately.
Imagine that despair. You've just seen the world's best doctor, and you still can't stop.
So Roland goes back to Jung and asks, "What is wrong with me?" And Jung drops the hammer. He tells him, "Medical science can't help you. You are a hopeless case."
But he offered a tiny sliver of hope.
He did. Jung told him that every now and then, alcoholics recover through a vital spiritual experience. He called it a huge emotional displacement. Basically, your reality needs to be completely shaken up.
You need to be rebooted.
Correct. And this brings us back to William James and his concept of ego deflation. The problem, according to these early thinkers, wasn't just the alcohol. It was the arrogant ego. The alcoholic thinks they are the general of the universe.
The general of the universe. I think we all know a few of those. Maybe we've been a few of those.
The ego thinks it can run the show. Surrender pops that balloon. It moves you from being the general to being a worker among workers. You stop being a god and you become a person again.
So that's the theory. Smash the ego, find a higher power, get sober. It works for millions. But our sources are not one-sided. We have some critiques here that argue this model isn't just flawed, but maybe dangerous for certain people.
Right. We have to talk about the feminist critique.
This really caught my attention. The argument is basically the 12 steps were written by white men in the 1930s who had a lot of societal power. Their problem was arrogance. But what if your problem isn't arrogance?
Exactly. If you're a woman or a person of color or from a marginalized group, you might have spent your whole life being told you are powerless. Society has been deflating your ego since birth.
So if you walk into a room and are told, surrender, you are powerless, that's not a solution. That might be re-traumatizing.
That's the argument. If your ego has already been crushed by trauma or oppression, you don't need ego deflation. You might need ego scaffolding. You need empowerment.
It really challenges the universality of the program. It suggests surrender is a medicine that works for one type of sickness entitlement but might be poison for another.
It's a crucial nuance, and is why we see other programs rising up. But before we get to those, we have to look at the other side of the critique spectrum, the Association of Certified Biblical Counselors.
Which is a huge pivot. So from the secular feminist critique to a strictly religious one. And they are not fans of the God as we understood him compromise.
Not at all. From their perspective, AA's inclusivity is actually its fatal flaw. They argue that by letting you pick your own God, AA is promoting idolatry.
That's a heavy charge.
It is. They argue AA offers half-truths. It talks about admission instead of confession of sin, sobriety instead of sanctification. Their view is that a God of your own choosing prevents people from finding the true God in their theology, Jesus Christ.
So AA is stuck in the middle. The secular world says it's too religious, and the religious world says it's not religious enough.
It's the classic middle way problem. By trying to appeal to everyone, you offend the purists on both sides.
So if you don't want the God part and you don't want the powerlessness part, where do you go? This is where modern alternatives like smart recovery come in.
SMART is fascinating because it's based on CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It flips the script. They don't ask you to admit you're powerless. They focus on self-reliance.
It's about tools, not miracles.
Right. It's about analyzing your triggers, managing your urges, taking control. It's a very proactive cognitive approach. It says you can do this if you learn the skills.
But here's the data point I found most interesting in the scientific reviews. When they actually study efficacy, does AA work versus does CBT work? What do they find?
They find that AA does work for a huge number of people.
Yeah.
But, and this is the kicker, the mechanism might not be what Bill Wilson thought it was.
It's not necessarily the spiritual awakening.
The science suggests it works through social and cognitive mechanisms. It works because you have a group of friends keeping you honest. That's social support.
Right.
And you have a framework to change your habits. That's cognitive restructuring.
So whether you call it God or the fellowship, the actual medicine is connection.
Exactly. It connects back to that idea of isolation. Addiction is a disease of isolation. Recovery is a process of connection. Whether you connect to a deity or just to the other people in the circle, you stop being alone with your own broken mind.
That makes sense. So we've covered the surrender and the theory, but we have to finish with the action. Steps 8 and 9. Amends.
This goes straight back to the Oxford group and their concept of restitution. You have to clean up the past.
But the sources make a really important distinction here between just saying, I'm sorry, and making a living amend.
Huge distinction. An apology is just words. I'm sorry I wrecked your car. Fine. But a living amend is behavioral. It's about restoring the balance.
Sometimes you can't say sorry. Maybe the person is gone. Maybe they never want to see you again.
Exactly. You shouldn't approach them if it's going to hurt them. That's a key rule. In that case, you make a living amend. You become a person who doesn't wreck cars anymore. You become a reliable father, an honest employee.
The phrase the sources use is cleaning up your side of the street.
I love that image. You can't control the traffic, you can't control the neighbors, but you can make sure your sidewalk is swept. It moves the focus from guilt, which is useless, to responsibility, which is empowering.
And that seems to be the genius of the system. It moves you from internal feelings to external action. You surrender inside so you can act outside.
Perfectly put. It's an internal surrender that leads to external power.
So let's zoom out. We've gone from the Oxford group's 4 absolutes to a tired Bill Wilson scribbling on a notepad. We've seen the fight to include agnostics and the modern pushback against the powerlessness model.
It's a program rooted in first-century Christianity, filtered through the psychology of William James, adapted for desperate men in the Great Depression, and now used globally. It's kind of a Frankenstein's monster of theology and psychology.
But it's a monster that works, and despite all the debates, the core insight seems to remain the same.
It does. Whether you're in a church basement or a smart recovery meeting, the shift is the same. Moving from isolation and self-will to connection and accepting help. It's about realizing you aren't the general of the universe.
Which is probably a relief for most of us, honestly. Being the general is exhausting.
It's the hardest job in the world, especially when you're unqualified.
Here's a thought to leave you with. We know the 12 steps were written in 30 minutes by a white man in 1938. They reflect the language, the prejudices, and the psychology of that time. If we were to sit down today, with everything we know about neuroscience, trauma, diverse psychology, and write a recovery program from scratch, would it look anything like the 12 steps?
That's the question. Would we design something sleeker, more scientific?
Or, and here's the twist, do the 12 steps work precisely because they are archaic? Because they're paradoxical and mystical and a little bit confusing. Maybe the human mind doesn't need a scientific manual. Maybe it needs a mystery.
That is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Sometimes the old tools cut the deepest.
Something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.